I am starting the webinar. So guests are coming in. Thank you once again for joining us today, everyone. And I hope it all goes well technically and we don't have technical issues.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Infra Plus webinar, Infrastructure for Fragmented Cities in its insert on the Middle East today. To start off, just to be clear, this session is recorded and it's also will be available on YouTube. We will share the link in chat. And the recordings will also be available on the Events Padlet website if you want to see this after the event, or if you have missed any of the presentations so far. So we have 4 speakers in line today, Dr. Christina Mehdi, Dr. Heba Khalil, Ms. Rita Nasr, and Dr. Heba Shoaib. Each presentation should take around 25 to 30 minutes, and after each presentation, we will open up a Q&A session for around 10 minutes. So please feel free to leave out your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Or in the chat. By the end of the session, we will also have an open discussion across all of the presentations. If you have any questions as well, please feel free to insert them. Also, feel free to raise your hand. We can, if you want to ask your question in person, we can let you unmute your microphone and ask your question as well. So that being said, we will start with our first presenter, Dr. Christina Mehdi. So Dr. Christina Mehdi is an associate professor in architecture, urban design, and urban planning. She was the head of Department of Architecture at Notre Dame University from 2016 till 2020. She's also a member of the UKRI International Development Peer Review College and a certified project manager professional. Her professional experience spans over 10 years as a consultant in architecture and urban planning in the MENA region. Her research focuses generally on public spaces in context of instability and understanding the role in social integration and inclusion. And today she will be giving a presentation on instability, informal mobility, and differentiated spatial experiences in Beirut. And with that, I give the floor to Dr. Christina Mehdi to start off the webinar.
Thank you very much, Yahya, for the introduction and for supporting me with sharing the presentation.
I'll share the presentation in a second. Just give me a moment here. Yeah. I apologize, this is taking a little bit of time. Yeah. There we are.
Yeah.
You.
Yes, thank you. If you could please move to the next slide. So whether you are coming to Lebanon from the northeast or from the southwest, this is a country that is a nexus actually between different cultures. Next, please. And I would like to imagine with you that we have landed at Beirut Airport, which you can see at the upper right corner of the slide. And we are heading somewhere towards the waterfront, which is referred to as the Corniche, which is at the lower right side. Next, please. This is your destination, and you really want to enjoy this coastal public space. Next, please. And as a newcomer into the city, perhaps you did not rent a car or you do not want to use the taxi, you decide to use the local public transport system. And this is what it will look like. Next, please. If you want to cross and find your way to the bus, it might be a little bit difficult without interacting with others. Next, please. So in this presentation and after this virtual visit to Beirut, I will try to give a few headlines related to informal mobility and instability in specific, then give an overview of the history of transportation in Beirut, and share an experience before giving some conclusions. Next, please. Next, please. My concern with informal mobility is really spatial as an urban planner. And I'm interested to understand the role of mobility, which is really a constituent of everyday life, and how it helps us to establish spatially connections to people, objects, information, but also values, habits, customs, etc. And as we move through the city, this is something that we learn and that we adapt and readjust according to circumstances. So this is the starting point of mobility that I would like to share with you. Next, please. And in specific, Lebanon being a country that is undergoing perpetual instabilities, it was important to me to investigate instability, mobility under instability and situations of securitization. So what happens when there is instability in a specific urban context? This leads eventually to securitization, which really affects accessibility to open spaces, urban spaces, including streets. Thus, could lead to the reduction or obstruction of one's mobility. With reduced mobility or obstructed mobility, this also generates feelings of fear. And if one is fearing how to navigate in a city in such an unstable context, this could lead to insular behavior. In relation to mobility, this could lead to preference of using private rather than public transport. Next, please. Imagine that you are in the city center, and this happens overnight, as was the case with the demonstrations in October 2019. A road that you take on your everyday trip is all of a sudden blocked, and you need to reroute your trip. Next, please. So, if you are actually a rider in a car, or if you are a rider in public transport, although you are sharing the same space, the same urban space, which is the street, you are sharing it in isolation, which could lead to certain normative understandings of who the people in the other mode of transport are or what they are experiencing. And if we are talking about an unstable context, there is a need actually to understand and interact with the other rather than segregate such public experiences. Next, please. So this is just one example of a main road in Beirut that shows or demonstrates what I was trying to say in terms of sharing the same space, but having very separate experiences that could lead to stereotyping and normative understandings of the other. Next, please. And why this interest in comparing or understanding these two different modes of transport in the case of an unstable context? It is because, of course, the private automobile is really an enduring system. Automobility becomes an enduring system in terms of infrastructure, services, ridership, that is very difficult to change or to shift to public transport, let alone if this transport is informal. Whereas in shared mobility, researchers argue that there is a co-constitution of urban meaning through the experience of spaces, subjects, shared experiences of ridership, and so on. And although this is not the topic of today's presentation, it is an important contributor to the everyday practice of mobility. Next, please. So when we look at literature on informal mobility globally, these are some of the topics that pop up. An absence of state endorsement that leads to a response by the market, negative perceptions of this mobility, the stereotyping of the users, considering it a safety and pollution threat or a nuisance that is really not desired. Next, please. And behind these perceptions of informal mobility come a lot of factors. Some of them will be addressed in this presentation, such as a laissez-faire attitude, where the informal mobility is allowed to exist despite its negativities, laxly enforced control and regulation on this informal mobility, or makeshift solutions. So I will touch upon some of them in the context of Beirut. And more specifically, in the presence of, or in the situation of a weak state, such as in Lebanon, and the absence of transportation strategies, there is bound to be certain tactics that try to meet people's collective needs for mobility. Next, please. And what happens in this formal-informal system? It is, as Ananya Roy actually says, a very entangled or fluid system that mixes between formality and informality. So if we think vertically in terms of power relations, the state could be licensing the vehicles that are operating this informal system. And the state is, in fact, even if laxly, controlling this transportation system. On the other hand, and horizontally speaking in terms of power relations, a set of operators or different operators are instating informal mobility rules and regulations and norms. They are deciding on the distribution of routes, of the rolling stock, and of the people involved in this network. So the power relation is really one of negotiations along new meanings and new criteria established between the state and the operators who are in fact part of the context, the political, economic, social, cultural context of the city. Next, please. So in summary, talking about mobility under instability, in an urban environment that is constantly, where everyday life is constantly or repetitively disrupted, it is important to see how the tactic of informal mobility is actually an opportunity for diversifying spatial experiences and possibly achieving social justice in the city. Next, please. So I will move to a historical overview on Beirut and its transportation system. And I would like to share with you this quotation that was actually, again, a study on informal infrastructure and the relation between it and the embedded politico-sectarian struggles in Lebanon. Next, please. To give you an overview of historical events that had an impact on transportation in Lebanon initially, I would like to indicate that planning for transportation and public transportation in Lebanon started during the Ottoman period in the 1900s. Then with the French mandate in 1920s and modernizing Lebanon according to French planning approaches, further development of the transportation network happened. After the constitution of the Republic in 1943, again, the government followed the planning models, the modernist planning model for cities, including Beirut, and we will see how that affected mobility in Beirut. 1975 to end of 1989 marks the period of the civil war in Lebanon, which led to the evacuation or annihilation of the city center and the division of the city into east and west, and the segregation of the population along religious and sectarian lines. Then we see that and then we see that the city grew spontaneously, expanded beyond the administrative boundaries of Beirut. And one of the events that has also affected mobility is the influx of Syrian refugees, who are highly dependent on public transportation. Next, please. So I would like to be more specific in this historical timeline and link that to some transportation events or important points. As I mentioned, the Ottomans were keen on showing Europe that they were equally capable of modernizing the cities that were under their rule. So the tramway was actually an active mode of transport as early as 1890 in Beirut. However, it overtook the traditional horse carriages and faced a lot of resistance from the population. Similarly, which actually led to the dismantling of the tramway system way before the Lebanese War during the period 1950s to 1960s. Similarly, people were not very comprehensive of using the bus as a mode of public transportation, and they instead preferred using the shared car, the shared taxi, jitney, or what is referred to in Lebanon as a service. And stations for the service were located in the city center, specifically around Martyr Square. Why is it important to note that spatial feature? It is because, as I mentioned, during the Civil War, the city center was completely evacuated. And the transportation node, which was in Martyr Square, was never reconstituted in the post-war reconstruction plan. Tragically, the outbreak of the Civil War was also marked by a shooting that happened on a bus with civilians in the eastern suburbs of Beirut. So there were some clues or symbols or signs that led gradually to the aversion of people towards the use of buses as a means of public transport. After the end of the war and around 1996, which I will come back to in further detail, there were plans to reinstate the bus system in Lebanon, as well as plans for metro lines. The metro line plans never materialized. The buses partially materialized. However, they transformed into an informal bus system, which I will be talking further about. And in 2019, just before the nationwide demonstrations, the parliament instated law number 135 to start working with the bus rapid transit project, which would have been funded by the World Bank. I can talk more about this in the discussion, but not as part of the presentation. And of course, then there was the financial crisis, but also COVID-19, like similar countries elsewhere in the world. Next, please. So what is the significance of tying mobility spatially to Beirut? As I said initially, the transportation system in Beirut was somehow radial. There was a main station situated in the city center that distributed to the peri-urban and suburban areas and further beyond. The city center was not existent anymore. Next, please. So we were dealing with a different spatial configuration for Beirut, which was a polycentric city without a center or a center isolated from the other parts of the city. And the polycenters were more or less acting independently without the direct need to communicate with one another, which led to disconnections, gaps in coverage, and barriers, as I will demonstrate with the experience at the end of this presentation. Next, please. So this is just to visualize on a map of Beirut what really happened during the 15 years of war. There was a demarcation line running from Martyr Square, so it germinated in Martyr Square and divided the city, but also the suburbs along Damascus Road into east and west, which caused a significant proportion of the population to relocate their places of residence, and very little commuting occurred between east and west during the war period. At the end of the war in 1989, this demarcation line, which was not a wall, but it was full of checkpoints, of course, and barriers, was restitched to allow the city to reunite again. Next, please. So this is what the current state of Martyr Square is. It is nowhere near a transportation hub. Next, please. And here in few slides, I will try to summarize how this informal transportation system, bus system, infiltrated into the capital city. So in 1996, the Ministry of Public Works and Transport, which has several offices under it, including the OCFTC, decided that they will activate 22 bus routes to cover administrative Beirut. And there was a schedule that was also accompanying this bus route with origins, destinations, and bus stops were placed all over the capital city. Very shortly after the start of this project, the bus stops were actually vandalized. In addition, there was no central station. As I showed in Martyr Square, no station was actually planned as part of the reconstruction. Instead, two main interchanges or roundabouts in East and West Beirut, Daura and Kola respectively, played the role of transportation hubs to service Beirut and its vicinities, neglecting the fact that the city after the war expanded into a polycentric urban region. And of course, these buses were cheaper than using the taxi or even the service, which meant that it was a lucrative business for some. And these some were actually individuals or families with politico-sectarian affiliations, which were interested to barge in and gain some profit from this newly emerging sector. So we saw that privately operated buses started dominating the same routes as the ministerial or publicly operated buses, leading to what is referred to as artisanal or unregulated shared transport. Next, please. So under three titles, licensing, control, and operation, I will try to very briefly summarize the state of this informal system back in the 90s and more recently. The problem with the licensing is that it is related to multiple governmental entities or authorities. So it is actually the Lebanese parliament, which is elected by the population, that distributes red plates or matriculation numbers to individuals and not to vehicles that are then used on service or the shared cab, vans, buses, taxi companies, individuals, the publicly operated buses, and the distribution of these red plates happens on the basis of a politico-sectarian quota. Then it is the Ministry of Interior that registers vehicles and controls their movement on the streets or in the street network, including where they park, where they take passengers, and so on. So in terms of control, we see that the buses, vans, and vehicles in general used for this shared transportation system are rather old. They are licensed, and they often operate on infrastructure that is inadequate for passengers who are pedestrians, of course. And there is competition with the public buses, the ones run by the ministry, on the same routes, which blurs, again, this formal-informal boundary. And in terms of operation, the buses run by the operators who belong to different communities actually have a self-sufficient system of maintaining, filling fuel, operating the buses that are self-sufficient, i.e. run by the communities. And the drivers actually have a very precarious situation and are usually daily wagers, competing for getting more passengers to get a little bit more income on a daily basis. And of course, sometimes there are routes where there is more supply than demand, which leads to conflicts when territories between different operators overlap. Next, please. What increased the complexity of the situation is that after the war and until recently, there are a lot of counterfeit red plates, which means an increased number of vehicles without an increase of demand because of the poor conditions of both the rolling stock and the network. A fragmentation of the management of the system, not only governmentally, but also among operators, laxly controlled vehicles, So the negotiations and the new meanings generated between the horizontal and vertical powers, and several syndicates that represent these operators and drivers, again echoing the community and the cultural embeddedness in Lebanon. Moreover, in terms of operation, we notice that instead of following the pre-war radiating itineraries for public transportation, the system is using the post-war divided, spatially divided routes of in Beirut. Next, please. So I will share here an experience before wrapping up. In Beirut, it is really a civic experience that changes from day to day, depending on boundaries that are shaped and reshaped in the city according to instabilities that occur. So whether you are driving a private car or you are using public transport, this experience might not be identical from day to day. Here, it is very important to highlight the work done by the Riders' Rights NGO that tried to give visibility to this informal map system by generating a participative map. By participative, I mean it was generated with the help of riders and drivers to facilitate the use of this system in Beirut. Next, please. And the demonstration that I would like to share with you today is that if one decides to take a tour around Beirut from the eastern to the western suburbs and vice versa, it would be interesting to see, using the map of Riders' Rights, which buses do we need to take to make this round trip. Next, please. So it seems that we need to take 4 or 5 buses to make this loop across the capital city. Next, please. And in this loop, if you look at the gray line, the gray dashed line, which is towards the top of the map, this is what a car trip from point A to B would look like. And then the colored itinerary with the numbers is what the public transport experience would be like. Noting that to close the loop with the public transport, you still have to cover a small part of the trajectory. Sorry, the second item in the legend should read pedestrian trajectory, not car trajectory. So you still have to walk a little bit to really reach the point from which you started this journey. Next, please. So some observations along this itinerary, and I will not read through them, I will only focus on the highlighted sentences, is really this disconnection, the difficulty of transferring across lines, the difficulty of finding the stops and the divides that exist across the lines, even if they have the same number, like number 15. Next, please. So based on this experiment, if I may say, or experience, what are some of the findings in relation to the spatial experience of mobility, which I started with at the beginning of the presentation? The suburbs are not really connected to the city center, and we know why what the reason is, the absence of a hub in the city center itself. It is not always easy to exchange between the available interchanges at Daura and Kola, respectively, in the eastern and western parts of the city. And only few routes cover the northeastern suburbs going directly to the southwestern suburbs and vice versa. And of course, even if you take that trip, and back in 2019, this is when I conducted this trip, you could evidently see the competition between the few remaining publicly run buses and the private operators, which could lead to debates or conflicts among the drivers. And finally, one notices that when there is a relation between communities living in different parts of the city, we could see buses that are connecting them, or even the duplication of the same bus number, i.e., following more or less the same itinerary, but having different ridership. Next, please. So to give you an idea about the stops that are mapped on the Riders' Rights maps are indicative of affordances of where one could disembark rather than actual physical stops, which also give the drivers the flexibility to even change their routes according to events that are happening in the city, such as road closures, checkpoints, repair works, and so on, which actually reflects a degree of adaptability to sudden events in this system. Next, please. This is just to give you an idea of how obscure the location of stations and stops could be. Next, please. And on the left-hand side, upper left-hand side, you can see the governmental buses with the light blue stripes that are distinguished from the rest of the buses that have no color or distinctive features. Next, please. And I arrive at some conclusions. Of course, there are a lot of similar trends between the informal mobility in the case of Beirut, as explained earlier in the presentation, and perceptions of this mobility. But I would like to highlight some of the specificities of Beirut in relation to contextual embeddedness. The first is perhaps that the communities that were divided after the 15-year war period manage only marginally to break this wartime divide with the using the public or shared transport network that is available, which means that there are a lot of disconnections, fluidities, and complications in interchanging if you want to navigate throughout the city. Users also indicated their interest in meeting others and considered that public transportation is one means to do that. So this was highlighted and is very important in the context of an unstable city. And the fourth point is that despite its flaws, the system showed some adaptability to abrupt events or changes that could be considered as an advantage in the case of this system and could be further explored. Next, please. I have two more slides talking about challenges and possible opportunities. Challenges specifically after COVID-19 have to do with lower ridership due to health and safety measures, the operation of less vehicles, especially due to expensive maintenance with the devaluation of the Lebanese currency, lately also the scarcity of fuel, and of course high unemployment rates, both on the side of drivers but also riders, which could again lead to reduced mobility for some. What about opportunities? Not to end on a pessimistic note. Next, please. And of course, I do not claim that these opportunities are short-term. These are more medium to long-term. What about working with municipalities and trying to organize at the micro walkable level what is happening with these stops and terminals? What about considering plans for subsidizing the system, even importing hybrid and electric buses that are not so dependent on fuel, which is imported in this country, and encouraging non-motorized mobility, which becomes part of a system of mobility, not only dependence on one mode, and planning for walkable urban areas that are not car-centered, as has been the history of Beirut so far. Next, please. With this, I end my presentation, and thank you for your attention, and I hope that an electricity cutout does not prevent me from interacting with you and any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christina, for an interesting presentation. We have time now for a quick Q&A session, so please feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A session or in chat. Seems we don't have questions so far, so like I would like to have a question myself. Dr. Christina, you did mention the sort of adaptability of the system in a way, and more informal systems tend to, in my view, come out as a way to sort of mitigate gaps that the formal system cannot really fill in, which in the case of a transportation system, it may be some routes that are not covered or more demand than what the government can supply. So my question was, in case of Beirut, is it the case that the informal bus routes were sort of mitigated, where the experience with the informal bus routes is different than the experience with the formal bus routes? Okay, yeah, we did. Oh, I apologize. We did lose Dr. Christini. So if you have any questions for her, feel free to leave them and in the Q&A we will send to her. She probably had an electricity cutout. We apologize for this inconvenience. So with this, we will be moving forward with the next presentation. Dr. Heba Khalil. Dr. Heba Khalil is a professor of sustainable urbanism and is a senior coordinator of architecture, engineering and technology in the faculty in engineering Cairo University. Her research focuses on community development in informal urban areas and urban metabolism and urban climate. She has 20 years of experience as an architect and urban planner and in sustainable development as well. She's also an alumni of the Special Program for Urban and Regional Studies in MIT. And she continuously seeks partnerships to support a new planning and design practice for sustainable urbanism. Today, she will be giving a speak on enhancing circularity for better livability in informal areas, using urban metabolism as an approach. So, Dr. Heba Khalil, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Yahya, for the introduction, and thank you for having me today. I'll be sharing my screen, so hopefully it works. Yep. Is it there? Great. Do you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, great. Okay. And it is in presentation mode, hopefully. Great. So my talk today will be about how can we enhance circularity for better livability, whether in formal and informal areas of urban metabolism. And I will be explaining this in a second. So what is urbanism in the global south? If you're familiar with that, then you know that is mostly informal urbanization. And interestingly, urbanism follows resources. In different countries, there is a different definition for what is informal. So that we can say that there is a wide spectrum of informality and formality, and between even urban and rural settlements. So for different contexts, these definitions and concepts vary very much. Of course, there is an interdependence among urban systems between the urban and its hinterlands, and the concept is very well known as planetary urbanization. And it's very apparent in most of our cities. And in my work, I try to learn from informal organic growth towards better quality of life and how we can be more efficient with the use of our resources in a more of a bottom-up approach. And the aim is, of course, to enhance circular economy, and now it's even the regenerative city with not just no waste, but also to regenerate the environment, kind of. So if you're familiar with that figure of this chart about combining the ecological footprint, how much resources are we using versus what kind of development are we providing for our inhabitants in different countries of the world, the HDI versus the ecological footprint, you find most of African countries, all the orange dots, are using less resources, but they're not providing enough for their inhabitants. Egypt is right there at the corner. So not so bad on the ecological footprint in terms of the world biocapacity, but also not high in our HDI or the Human Development Index. But let me say that being less consuming doesn't really mean you're more green. You just might be more poor. So bear this in mind. And if we look about what are the Egyptian, and what we say we are contributing, or what our goals for improving the adaptation. We are more concerned with, of course, with climate adaptation, not climate mitigation. We are a developing country. So most of the sectors within this document is, they are more about coastal zones, agricultural sector, water resources, rural population, energy, tourism, health, but not necessarily any focus on the urban sector and where the most of the consumption takes place. If we look at Cairo, a very old photo, 1904, most of it is empty. This is a photo in over the Malik Island. And in only 100 years time, you can find that the city is mostly built with very high buildings and very high density. And the city expands. This is a night vision of Cairo with all of its, we call them the suburbs or the new cities, the surrounding new cities. And of course, it is very, it's a mega city with more than 20 million people. If we look at its ecological footprint of Egypt, how much resources are we using versus the biocapacity of Egypt? So yes, on the world scale, we are doing okay. But if you compare our consumption with our biocapacities or the resources that we have, we are suffering from a deficit, and we cover this deficit through imports. So we rely so much on imports from outside to cover this resource gap. And as you see on the right hand side, Cairo from one end to the other is almost 100 kilometers wide, and this is not, the city is not stopping. Now we have the new capital, and from one end, so from the western side where I live to be able to go to the new capital, I'll be driving around 120 to 130 kilometers each way, which is, I think it's enormous. Okay, but if you're if you're not familiar with Cairo, as Dr. Christine took us to Beirut, I'll try to take you to Cairo. So have different, if you browse the internet of photos for Cairo, most probably you'll get either the right hand side photos or the bottom side one, but not necessarily the left upper corner. Most of Cairo is as you see that the city or our city, Cairo, is mostly informal. Some estimates say it's 50% or 60% or even 70% is informal. So all the blue areas in the map are informal areas, and all the yellow areas are planned, or yeah, they are formal or planned. Now the technical or the legal term for the informal areas is unplanned. So we officially we're not using informal anymore, kind of. We're using planned and unplanned, which is another debate rather than being formal or informal. And Cairo, of course, is one of the fastest growing cities. It was estimated to be the fastest growing city in 2017. It even outgrew other mega cities in India. Sorry, yeah. So just to explain what is informalization in the Egyptian context, for those who are not familiar with that, basically we have agricultural land, of course, to the Nile. All this agricultural land, we illegally subdivided. We illegally subdivide the agricultural basins into plots. We sell these plots or we build them. And in 30 to 40 years, perhaps 50 years, you have a completely consolidated area like that. So in 40 years from this side to that side, and you get a big informal area. So as you see from the photos, our informal areas are not slums. They are not makeshift. They are not low-rise buildings. These are concrete structures, skeleton buildings, very good structure stability, if I may say so. In the height of buildings could reach even 10 floors and 12 floors in some instances, but the streets are very narrow as they follow the irrigation canals that used to be there before becoming an urban area. And as I mentioned, this is different than what are called slums in other parts of the world. The terms could be slums, could be favela, could be kampung. barrio, you name it. These are different, the shanty towns in other parts of Africa. The term that we have that is similar to these concepts is unsafe areas, and we have this in the law since 2008. We've categorized the unsafe areas into 4 categories, and they more or less follow the criteria used by the UN Habitat to define what are some areas suffering from the inadequate water or sanitation, or structural stability. So after this quick review of the concepts in terms of the Egyptian way, I will take you in one of my projects that I started with my students in collaboration with partners. The project is called Urban Insight Project. It was done in Cairo, and this project was in collaboration with the EcoCity Builders. They are an NGO in the US, and they have several projects around the world. We had a collaboration with Mondiapolis University in Morocco. So we did this project in parallel between Cairo and Casablanca. And it was done with my students in different courses. And of course, in collaboration with other professor, my mentor, Dr. Saharate. So in this project, what we did is we selected 2 neighboring districts in Cairo. As I mentioned, Cairo is 20 million people. We selected 2 different districts. One of them would be an informal area, or in more legal terms, unplanned. And the other one is a planned or a formal area. So one is Mbaba, which is the informal area. And just across the Nile, we have the Zamalek area, which is a more upscale area that is, of course, formal. What we did is, in our methodology, is that we started discussing the literature review. We had a lot of discussions with leadership from the area. And then we went on a lot of transit walks. So in order to identify the assets in the area, we did a lot of transit walks with the community over there. We came up with our own data sets. We had to do urban surveys because the data that we acquired from the government, if you are able to acquire it, is not accurate, and it's not on the building scale. Perhaps it's more on the block scale. And then we created or categorized our archetypes for the different buildings in order to map how the resources are being used in these different districts. So the main aim for us for this study is to see how the resources flow through these districts, whether energy, water, sanitation, water, energy, food, mobility, materials, and ICT. Specifically, we did water, energy, mobility, and materials. So after creating our database and knowing the different archetypes that are present in the study area, we conduct in-depth investigations on the household level, or knowing how the specific resource is being used. And then what we do is we go to the upstream. What happens to the resource before coming into the area? So if the water is coming from the Nile, for instance, what happens at the water and also what happens in the downstream. So after coming out of the area, what happens to the resource? If it goes to the water treatment facility afterwards, and then it reaches the sink. Then we create Sankey diagrams. I will show you in one slide what are the Sankey diagrams I'm referring to. And then we try to come up with solutions of how to intervene in such context with the collaboration with the community to see how and what are the actions that could be taken into considering different issues. So these are the Sankey diagrams that came out of this study. As you see, this is a very quick comparison between the consumption patterns between the informal area in Baba and Zamalek, which is a formal area, and looking at different materials. For instance, the consumption of paper and organic is could be different. I mean, these are the different resources, the bigger resources used in low income areas, while the higher income areas, they have metals, they have plastics that you wouldn't find in Baba. This is of course because of if you have more, if you're affluent, you tend to use more materials. So you have the higher consumption in terms of organic paper, metal and glass. If also you calculate per capita, so per person. And interestingly, if you look at some of the arrows, if you can see my mouse, so what happens to the recycling in Zamalek, 70 to 80% of the waste gets recycled. So these are the arrows that go up again into the production. But in Mbaba, as most of the waste, it's not recyclable. So very few, or 20% even, is recycled, while most of the waste goes to transit. And this is a very apparent difference between these two because of the nature of the waste that is being generated from a higher income area, the Zamalek area, versus the lower income area. Interestingly, in both cases, organics are problematic. We don't have a way of dealing with organic waste in an efficient way yet in Cairo specifically, and of course in Egypt. But we have issue with the traditional way was feeding them to pigs, but at the point of time we slaughtered a lot of pigs due to the swine flu, and the system was not hasn't recovered since then efficiently. And also a very important note here, because of the formal and the informal, is that all the recycling that is being done in Zamalek is being done by actually the informal sector. So the informal waste pickers are the backbone of the recycling system in Egypt. So even if we're very happy with the very high rates of recycling, this is more the work of the informal sector. So you have the low consumption and the high reuse in Mbaba versus the high consumption with 70 to 80% of reuse. And the question comes how to create value for the downstream. How can you prevent of waste on the streets, specifically if things are not recycled? And the mobility, interestingly also, and I think that also relates to Dr. Christine's presentation, the use of public transportation, whether it is being, is it formal or informal? So in Mbaba area, we have a high reliance on bus. There is a reliance on subway, but not because the subway is, it wouldn't be passing through Mbaba, but a lot of people who reside in this area actually work on the other side of the city. So they use the subway in their their daily trip to reach their destination. And as you see, the Sankey diagram shows your daily trip from home to destination. So you start by walking, then you take a bus or a subway, or perhaps you continue on walking sometimes. And when you reach your destination, you still have another part to walk. While in the Zamalek area, you can find that most of the trips are being done by motorized vehicles, whether they are privately owned or the taxi. And there is the bus. There is some people use the bus, but because of the planning of Zamalek, the buses are only allowed into two streets, and they're not allowed in other streets. And you see that there is a very small percentage using the subway, although there is a station a subway station in Zamalek, but it is not in the popular area, I mean, not where people actually, or the people live, or the uses like schools, universities are located. Is on the other side of the island, where not a lot of people are commuting over there or using it. Also, very few people rely on foot, although the area is very walkable. Zamalek is known to be a walkable neighborhood, but most of the destinations are outside. So for the residents of Zamalek, they rely so much on their vehicles to go outside. Their destinations are outside the island, and a lot of the people who are using the facilities on the island are actually coming from outside. So all the recreational facilities, the people coming for cafes, for schools, for universities are coming from outside. So again, they are not walking. So it was interesting to see how, although the image of the area could be walkable, but people are not walking so much. And the question is how to capture the characteristics of the informal local ecosystems becoming affordable, accessible, and efficient. So yeah, you have sometimes systems that are being imposed by the government, but they are not very affordable. So this would be taken into consideration. And the study that we've done actually showed us that there is a need to devise a city, before devising a citywide project, to see how is the detailed consumption patterns in different parts of the city. If you have a mega city like Cairo, or even smaller cities, and you have different districts, then you need to understand the consumption pattern, the demand at the district level in order to have adequate solutions. And of course, lowering consumption does not contradict with promoting better quality of life. You want to lower your consumption, but having better walkability, better public transportation. Of course, the local solutions provide jobs that build on existing skills. And a lot of these local solutions are not highlighted so much. We usually, when you think of solutions, we are very top-down minded, which proved to be inefficient or inefficient for quite some time when we had a waste management system that was imposed by the government, bringing in international companies from Italy, from Egyptian context, but it was not successful at all. It actually was a total failure, and we had to go back to the informal waste pickers again. But of course, we don't want to have the informal waste pickers with their current unhygienic situation. So there should be some sort of improvement in the system, and a lot of that work was done by the former Minister of Environment, Dr. Laila Skander, in that sense. So local solutions are a key in helping to provide jobs, ownership, and ensure also the sustainability of actions and programs. And these, you can find alternative solutions, of course. And tying this back to all the agendas that are there, the SDGs, the idea of promoting resource efficiency in planning and in building, it ties with a lot of the international agendas, the new urban agendas, the different SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and of course the 10-year framework program for Africa. So we have different levels of regional and worldwide, just to tie to the underlying is to try to adapt to become more affordable and inclusive, and of course it's important to integrate approaches. So not only looking at the demand side or the supply side, in most of the cases for the government for the government initiated solutions, it was more of on looking on the supply side. Let's improve our grids, the energy mix, let's incorporate renewable energies. But also on the demand side, it's very important to think of three levels. First is the individual. How can we alter the behavior of people or the appliance choice, for instance? And second is on the building performance, so the building itself. And then on the third is the neighborhood level design and city plan. So you have three levels on the demand, and both of them are important to reach an integrated approach of consumption and production. We try to read this in order to enhance the circularity and provide better livability. These are just some of the related publications, and I welcome any questions in that regard. Some of my current work is about gender equity and also looking at using different lenses, looking at the city. And just another project I'm working on now, creating a city at Cairo University. And another project about land governance in collaboration with other African countries specifically in North Africa currently. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Heba, for your very interesting presentation. And we still have around 10 minutes to go with questions. So if any participant have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A session. So far, we don't have questions, but I sort of do have my own. So it's quite an abstract question where I'm I was wondering on sort of the self-efficiency of waste management in Imbaba in itself, because as far as I understand, in the context of Egypt, most of the waste management and recycling is done by Azbit Zabalin, which is a different informal neighborhood in Cairo. So I was really wondering whether Imbaba in itself as an informal settlement is self-contained and they have their own informal system of waste management or not, in a way.
Yeah, so Imbaba has its own, I mean, there is an area that is adjacent to it, also called Zabalin. So we have different Zabalins in Cairo, and they are kind of using sorting, starting with sorting the garbage, but not the Imbaba garbage. So they recycle the garbage from other parts of the city, the affluent part, where the garbage actually has value. So if even the consumption or the demand that we've shown, actually the consumption of waste in Imbaba shows that the waste coming out is more organic or very some paper sometime, but no plastics, no metal. People in that area, they don't drink in cans. If they use water, plastic bottles, they reuse them. So they reuse a lot of their resources and they don't throw it away unless it is totally consumed. That's why if no single solution can have, or no single system you can deploy it in different parts of the city. And interestingly, also we found that although the consumption or the consumption of per capita in Imbaba is lower than in Zamalek area, but you find a lot of garbage on the streets in Imbaba because due to the sheer amount of people that are residing over there, like the density could be 5 to 6 times as much in Zamalek, 4 to 5 times as much. So even if you have lower consumption per capita, but have more people living in one area, then you have accumulated waste on the streets, and they are not removed in a rate that is enough or adequate to the rate of production or of waste production, I mean. And this is not only in Imbaba, it's also in all the other informal areas I've worked on, whether in Kalubeya, in Giza, or even on the Cairo side.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we have one question coming from Mauricio Estrada. He's saying, thanks a lot for an interesting presentation. Could you speak a bit about how the data collection for the Sankey diagrams was carried out?
Okay, so we had our, we call it the UMIS, the Urban Metabolism Information System. And this was developed by our partners at EcoCity Builders and also other professors from UC Berkeley. And this system is with just to have like a sheet. The students, as I said, it was done with the help of the students. We do two things. We do after identifying different archetypes. So for instance, if we're talking about waste management, we choose different buildings of, different land use at first, the residential, if you have different like retail or workshops or even a mosque or something. And also in the residential, we have the different household size. So we're identifying different samples, and then we take a number of samples in each category, and we do in-depth investigation. So we ask them on a daily basis or in a week time, how much waste do you generate in terms of paper, in terms of organic food, in terms of all the materials that are possible. And in that sense, and sometimes in few times we cross-reference with the actual garbage that we can see that is specifically in Zamalek area, the more affluent. We can see how much. I mean, the bag is outside the apartment, so we can see what's going on over there. But also an interesting thing is some people are a bit shy on saying how much do they throw away. Specifically in more affluent area, they would say we don't throw food at all. We don't throw food. This is, of course, it is unethical. It is not religious. Some consider that, but in actual facts, people throw food. So we tend to ask questions in different ways in order to get the accurate information. And after doing that, we everything into the UMIS, and we have these that develop a CSV, and then we have a Sankey, we call this Sankey generator, and you input the CSV file and you get the Sankey diagram from that. Hope I answered the question.
Yes, thank you. I think we have room for one more question here. This one is quite general in a way. In 10 years' time from now, how do you expect Cairo will cope with the rapid population and the waste recycling concept in Cairo?
Yeah, throughout my work in different areas, people are very, very innovative in terms of how to capture the value of each and every resource. Because if you are in a resource scarcity environment, then you make the best out of what you have. And this is not just for the case I've shown you, but it is all around. And more and more now we have startups in more affluent areas. So you have apps that you can call someone who can come and pick up your oil, your used oil, or your used plastics or something. So for more affluent areas, these could be, these are in fashion now. And on the other side, we have even different systems, informal systems. So you have the informal waste pickers, and even within this system, they have categories, like they have an inner structure. They have the bosses, kind of, and then there's people who actually go up the stairs and bring the garbage. And then we have another category there called the scavengers. So the scavengers see again, go through the whatever waste was left out of the former tool. So after the informal waste picker come up to your apartment, take the waste and then give it to his boss. Any waste that is on the street, we have the scavengers who go through this. So I mean, there are a lot of people who are embedded in that system, and it seems to be very, very fluid. Very fluid. But at the same time, it is very coping with what is going on and moving patterns. You can see that an informal waste picker it brings in a new van or something in order to reach new areas. I live now on the suburb, so I see a different pattern of how the waste picker comes and picks the different materials. So they are adapting even for the different changes, the spatial different changes that the city is experiencing. So and also, I don't want to sound always negative, but the government is actually promoting the establishment of different recycling facilities, and now they are opening. So I think we have 2 or 3 in operation now, and more to be open. So it is also moving towards more kind of institutionalized, or even more on the bigger scale that you can say it can cope with more and more people. The problem just remains if that let's say this is not working. We don't like this so much. So let's just abandon what's going on and let's bring in a foreign system and try to embed it or try to enforce it on the people. This won't work, and it would never work, and I don't think it will work ever. So the current system is evolving and it is adapting to different new needs. So I think it will be stay coping. What is our role as urban planners or even urban managers or the municipalities, just to facilitate the efficient system that is existing, and also to minimize the risks and the hazards, the non-hygienic hazards that these waste pickers suffer from through their work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this. And for the interest of time, I'll be moving to the next presentation. So I'm just double checking Ms. Rita Nasr if she has a proper internet connection to move forward with her presentation. If she can just confirm, that would be great. Yes, okay, perfect. So we move now to the Ms. Rita Nasr's presentation. Ms. Rita Nasr holds a bachelor's degree in architecture from Notre Dame University, Lebanon, as well as a master's degree in urban planning from the Lebanese University. Her major research interest lies in issues related to urban planning, solid waste management, and its linkages to territorial governance, institutions, and power. She's a PhD researcher at the University of Reading and the Business School. And in addition to her PhD research and studies, she is undertaking the role of the editorial administrator of the Journal of Planning Theory. Today, she will be giving a presentation on instability, informal mobility, and differentiated spatial experiences in Beirut. And with that, I leave the floor to her, and I will be sharing my screen in a minute for her to start her presentation. Ms. Rita,
hello everyone. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Yahya, for introducing me. I'm glad to be here today presenting my PhD research, which is about the institutional role of middlemen in developing recycling practices within the context of Lebanon. Please accept my apologies for not being able to share my video due to technical issues. Please next. I will highlight problematic aspects and challenges. I will also present aims and objectives of the research, in addition to the research questions and then the research theoretical framework. Afterwards, I will move on to the adopted methodology, and finally, I will present some preliminary findings. Please next.
Okay, I think we are having some connection issues with Ms. Rita. So I think for now we have to move to the next presenter, and hopefully Ms. Rita will have had sorted the internet issue after Dr. Heba Shoaib's next presentation. On that note, I'll be first introducing Dr. Heba, and we'll be moving to her presentation. So Dr. Heba Shoaib is an architect, urban designer, and academic. She's currently a project manager at Takween Integrated Community Development in Cairo, and an adjunct lecturer in at the Arab Academy of Science and Technology. Her experience spans over 15 years, in which she had led multiple urban upgrading projects at Takween, with a range of international agencies, including UN Women, UNDP, and GIZ. These have been mostly in areas of public space design, development of natural heritage sites, and upgrading of informal settlements. She has over 10 years of experience as an academic as well. She has been teaching in a number of courses in multiple universities in Cairo, including Cairo University, the American University in Cairo, and the Arab Academy for Science and Technology. And she will be giving a presentation today on highway urban assemblages and the right to the city, with a case study on Cairo's ring road. And with that, I give the floor to Dr. Heba Shoaib to start off her presentation.
Thank you very much, Yahya, for the presentation, and I'm really happy to be with you today. I should be starting now. So, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. So today we're speaking about the topic of highway urban assemblages and the right to the city. Actually, this was a research that I've started during my PhD and completed during my PhD as well, and had been reflected on through different projects that I've worked with Takween in other informal areas, and did extend my research in the topic. So today, throughout this presentation, we're going to be learning about the impact of urban highways on the city, and would be with specific focus on the Korean context. We'll introduce the concept of highway urban assemblages as an approach and as a concept, and how it could be a potential to reclaim the right to the city. And then we're going to be investigating or exploring two of these highway urban assemblages and two of the informal settlements in Cairo, namely Azbat Khairallah and Azbat al-Nasr, which both intersect with Cairo's ring road, and then concluding remarks on the presentation. So first, speaking about why this topic is timely and why it's always developing through time. Early on, since 2019, actually since the recent decades, there have been extensive constructions of urban highways, and specifically flyovers over Cairo, which do cause splintering impacts on the social and physical fabric of the city. And these constructions or implementations are always presented as a vision for progressing and developing the country as a national vision for the city, or for Egypt as a whole. Taking from this, the Minister of Transport had mentioned that there is an allocated budget for numerous projects in the transport sector, of which bridges and flyovers and urban highways come at the priority of these projects to be implemented between 2014 and 2024, which then currently we're seeing the implementation of these bridges. Taking all of these implementations and constructions in our city, it's really necessary to go down and have a more thorough understanding of how these urban highways impact our urban environment. Specifically in a city like Cairo, with dense urban communities, scarcity of public open space, and austere socioeconomic conditions. So As a basic definition, highways or principal roads are major components of transportation infrastructure networks. They always represent a tool and a symbol of modernization, and always come as a form of a formal act on the city taken from a pragmatic mobility requirement. However, the intersection of these urban highways with our contemporary megacities, specifically in a city like Cairo, it's always seen as a heterogeneous ensemble, and this we're going to go through further into our presentation, that has problematic impacts on the city, and yet also can be seen to have potential urban compositions. So in order to have a closer look on this impact, it's necessary to study how this heterogeneous ensemble has physical, socioeconomic, and environmental impacts on the city. The major of these impacts comes in forms of physical fragmentation, and this comes actually from the spatial structure of the highways themselves, their huge and monumental scales, and how this scale has an impact on the city fabric as well. Coming from this structure, which constitutes of the body and the columns, specifically when we're speaking about elevated urban highways, this construction produces different types of what we call infrastructural space, which comes as a resultant of this intersection of urban highways with the city, and produces different types of infrastructural space, either adjacent to the highway itself, underneath the space, or captured space between its exit and entry ramps. And these spaces, which have different meanings, such as interstitial spaces or lost spaces, have been further interpreted for further uses later on, but initially they are fragmenting the urban space of the city. As we see, these are the different examples of different typologies of the infrastructural space associated with urban highways. Sometimes they're left and neglected with a total loss of space in cities, as previously mentioned, with scarcity of public open space. Sometimes they come as spaces for accumulation of solid waste, and sometimes unsafe areas. And sometimes they're recognized for their potential to produce more activities in this public open space. Other impacts of the implementation or the construction of urban highways comes also to the limiting access between the affected residential settlements or communities, either between the neighborhood itself. At times we have the urban highway bisecting these neighborhoods, as we're going to see into our examples later on, or limiting their access to other parts of the city. As we see, we don't have a planned access or relation between these neighborhoods and the highway. As we said before, having these infrastructural spaces allows for public space encroachments, depending on the different typologies. If we have shaded spaces beneath these urban highways, and we have them connected to visible parts of the city, always urban residents find potential for different commercial and recreational activities in these infrastructural spaces. One of the major impacts as well is the social fragmentation, and which leads to social segregation in many communities, which comes as a resultant of some communities or some neighborhoods which have been bisected by half, leaves one part deprived of many privileges, such as public services, including hospitals, schools, and other facilities, and makes the access between these two bisected parts more limited, making one part privileged than the other, which leads to other forms of social segregation as well. Also, in the continuing works of the expansions to the ring road in Egypt, as we're seeing, and to building different urban highways, many people are losing their homes, which come to be into the locations of these implemented bridges. So this leads to the resettlement in other areas, or maybe compensation in other forms, and sarcastically in other forms which did not lose their homes. They have a huge invasion of privacy where the homes and the ring road come in direct connection to each other. Also, the implementation of these urban highways has a huge impact on reducing safety, as residents find themselves directly accessing the ring road for public transport, or sometimes crossing the ring road to other parts of their neighborhood. This causes a lot of traffic accidents and leads to road deaths as well. Coming to the environmental impacts, and this is also a topic that's hugely under public discussion nowadays, it's how much we have to compromise of green spaces into our cities to build these urban highways. And places like Heliopolis witnessed such a compromise of around 90 fadans of green spaces in order to implement these urban highways. And also speaking about the air and noise pollution, where the residential neighborhoods come in close proximity, as previously mentioned, to these urban highways, putting all the residents at risk of health hazards and reducing their quality of life as well. So, talking about this impact of urban highways on the city, many cities around the world have started to come or recognize these negative impacts on the cities and started to have different strategies and revisit their highway policies, seeing what should be done with the existing urban highways and if their presence are actually beneficial or their removal would be more beneficial. And this led to removal of different urban highways throughout different developed countries, such as the United States and cities like Seoul, and replacing them with parks and boulevards. However, these solutions might not be applicable to different cities in developing countries or the Middle East, as these solutions require high budgets and require high community support. So if our urban environment is left with multiple urban highways having these drastic impacts on the city, we're left to think of other ways of how to rehabilitate these urban highways and how to reduce their negative impacts on the city and reassemble them with the surrounding communities. So it becomes a necessity to understand how to extract potential to eliminate these negative impacts on the city. This, coming to the second part, is producing or presenting the approach of how we can explore or investigate these highways within the urban context, explore their potential, and see how they can assist or help urban residents in reclaiming their right to the city. So, first, introducing the concept of the right to the city, as of course produced by Lefebvre early on in the 1960s, and how it reflects on multiple rights of the urban residents, rights to make their own ideas in the urban space, right to use multiple services, the right to space, and the right to be engaged in the different urban transformations into the city. So it's quite important to see how the impact of urban highways, which are implemented as a means of easing traffic and easing mobility from one space to the other, what is the actual impact of these urban highways on the right to the city of the urban residents? So this could be explored through multiple concepts or derivatives from the right to the city, either the right to participate in the decision-making of these urban highways, the right to public services, the right to public open spaces, the right to a health and safe environment, adequate housing, urban mobility, and the right to work. So in order to study these urban highways and see how they could contribute to this concept of the right to the city, it's important to study them within their diverse contexts, since they don't have the exact or the same impacts in different contexts, and they should be studied within the interactions with the surrounding urban communities. Therefore, in order to do so, the approach of assemblage urbanism has been used to tackle this heterogeneous ensemble as an urban assemblage or a highway urban assemblage, and I would be defining what I mean by this concept. So it's basically reading the urban highway as an ensemble of both human and non-human actors, and both have active roles which do affect each other in producing different types of urban transformations. And this comes in relation to the geographic context, the physical features of this ensemble, and the socioeconomic context as well, reflecting the socioeconomic backgrounds of the urban communities affected by this construction. Why this approach was chosen, it's actually an implication of the assemblage theory and actor network theory in the urban field. And this concept specifically recognizes the dynamic interactions between these heterogeneous components when we have human and non-human actors within these diverse contexts. They have the ability to reproduce different urban transformations within the city. So it's actually an approach to read the complexity of the interactions of urban highways within these diverse urban settlements. So breaking down the concept, it's basically reading all the different actors within this assemblage, whether the physical actors taking the highway, its different components, its different spatial attributes, such as the infrastructural space, the human actors, urban communities engaged, different governmental entities, different local NGOs, and as we call the contextual and temporal aspects, how this assemblage differs from one context to the other, and how this relates to the current socioeconomic and maybe political struggles in the city as well. So taking this concept, it's a way to read how the different intersections of urban highways with the city, taking these diverse geographic context and how or when do they intersect with the urban communities, how this produces different types of assemblages or different urban transformations, as we see, that reflect different concepts. So sometimes they serve as spaces or pillars for commercial activities, engaging different types of street vendors when we have more visibility and access to the roads. Sometimes the adjacent infrastructural space also serves other types of commercial activities as well. So basically, it's a way of decomposing or breaking down this ensemble or heterogeneous components, as we call it, and we see how do they interact with each other and when they do this interaction to produce different urban transformations, meeting the needs of these communities. Taking this, it was actually interesting to investigate how such an heterogeneous ensemble would act in communities or in informal settlements which have specific socioeconomic and geographic conditions. They have dense urban communities. Most of them lack a lot of basic services, utility networks, and have scarcity of public open space. So taking this composition with its different potentials and its intersection with these neighborhoods has been interesting actually to see how different potentials are recognized and how different actors have been engaged in these processes, producing different types of urban transformations that actually do give insights on how the development of informal settlements is affected by the intersection of these highways. So we're going to see an investigation of two of these informal neighborhoods that intersect with Cairo's ring road that was constructed into the 1980s, and how these two communities do share some of the common impacts and how different interventions were associated with these urban assemblages based on the needs of the communities. So these are the two informal settlements which have been chosen to be studied. The first is Azbet Khairallah, which is bisected by the ring road, as we can see on this map. And it's located on the eastern side of the city. It's an informal neighborhood which lies in Cairo Governorate. It has a total area of 2 kilometers squared and approximately 650,000 inhabitants. And the other area is Azbet and Nasr, which is further east to this informal settlement. It's more of a smaller area with 0.5 kilometers squared and almost 25,000 inhabitants. Studying both neighborhoods, the construction of this ring road did create drastic negative impacts on both areas with social and physical fragmentation, like we're going to see further on, deteriorated environmental condition and poor levels of accessibility. However, it did give more potential or spatial characteristics to these intersections, giving more visibility at parts where the neighborhood intersects with the ring road and producing different types of infrastructural space, which was used differently, as we're going to see later on. Producing these assemblages, it did encourage a lot of formal and informal interventions, which did enhance economic activities, improve the level accessibility and connectivity, and produce different types of vibrant public space. So first, we're studying the intersection of the ring road with Azbet Khairallah. One of the major impacts of this construction was it did bisect the city in half, the neighborhood in half, leaving the major public services on the northern side of the ring road and leaving, as we previously said, the lower part segregated and deprived to directly access these public services. And the only connection that we had between these two bisected parts were underground tunnels that have people access from one side to the other. However, these tunnels were in a very bad condition, deteriorated, and limited the access between both areas. These are some results of the impact of this construction on the city, different types of infrastructural space adjacent to the ring road. The case in Azbet Khairallah is elevated on embankments, so it did have a lot of adjacent space, which was sometimes open for public space encroachments, and sometimes we had encroachments on the ring road itself as well. And we had other impacts, as we said, social fragmentation, bisecting the neighborhood in half, having the public services on one side did limit the access to public services to the underprivileged part of the community, and also did reduce the level of safety. As we said, people had to cross the ring road if they cannot access the tunnels, and the tunnels themselves were not safe as well. This did, of course, open to informal interventions, and one of these major or most famous elements are the pedestrian access stairs from the neighborhood to the ring road to access services, public transport, and this is common on different parts of this intersection, and the encouragement of commercial and recreational activities as well, which, reflecting on that, did give the people to access the right to the public space, the right to work, even the right to urban mobility. And this is actually open for exploration. And did it really meet this right, or it does need further enhancement to meet these rights to the city? One actually of the very interesting formal interventions which brought different actors and did serve multiple aspects of the right to the city is a project conducted by Takween Integrated Community Development, the company which I'm working with currently. I haven't been directly on this project, but it was one of the many very interesting projects that did tackle one of the very negative impacts of the ring road on this neighborhood. As we said, the tunnels connecting both parts of the neighborhood were in a very deteriorated condition, limiting the access of many residents, of which specifically were women and children trying to access the schools on the other side. So taking this condition, the company attempted to develop solutions to address this issue and multiple issues in relation to safety and connectivity between both parts, environmental issues, as we had a lot of sewage problems in the tunnel as well, and also introduced street art as an enhancement to the design or the upgrading of this tunnel. So an upgrading to one of the tunnels, to one of the major tunnels, which had higher pedestrian flow between both parts, was upgraded. And what was interesting, actually, the different actors which were engaged in this project, from governmental entities to funding agencies, of course, local NGOs, and engaging also the local communities. They were engaged in different parts of the process in designing and upgrading this tunnel, which I think reflects on multiple parts, engaging people into the decision-making and design process, the right to the space, the right to a more healthy environment, to urban mobility, and easier access to public services as well. What's actually interesting in the case of Izbat al-Nasr is the similar issue of segregation between both parts. However, the morphology of Izbat al-Nasr is quite different. So these are the boundaries of the neighborhood, having the northern parts also, which was more privileged with more public services. And we have this part below the ring road. It's called Izbat Abu Ali, which is segregated by this construction of the ring road, leaving it less privileged than the northern part. And we have a tunnel in underneath this ring road and at this part, which connects both areas and actually does connect the people in the northern part to other services down in El Basatin and this area. So these were some similar impacts on Izbat al-Nasr from physical fragmentation. Also, we have a lot of adjacent infrastructural space, and it becomes really critical at different parts, depends on the section, how we intersect with this ring road. The limited accessibility, of course, caused by this intersection, and always these types of tunnels underneath are usually unsafe at night. They have a problem with the lighting issues, which doesn't make their crossing always the easiest solution to the residents. Also, as we said, the lower part of Izbat Abu Ali did not receive the same attention as the northern part of Izbat al-Nasr. Izbat al-Nasr did have different upgrading projects by GIZ in terms of street paving, street lighting, implementing further public services. However, this part did receive less attention and had a more deteriorated condition, seen as a different part of Izbat al-Nasr as well. The parts adjacent to the ring road always receive the attention due to their visibility and direct access to different modes of transport, and they do encourage different commercial and recreational activities into these spaces, always appropriated according to the spatial qualities of these spaces. And what was interesting also in the spaces underneath the ring road were a lot of sorting activities into the recycling process, which is an activity that takes place in Izbat al-Nasr as well, did take place into these areas, and they used it as main storage spaces. Of course, this was unsafe in a lot of aspects, but it did reveal potential on how people do see the potential of these spaces and how they see them to meet their different economic needs. And similarly, the case of these stairs that always are seen as important to access these urban highways, either their spaces or a means to access the public transportation themselves, and reflecting also on how these informal interventions did serve the people's right to the city. These informal interventions also could be complemented with formal interventions on seeing these potentials and addressing these negative impacts they had on the city. So basically, to conclude, just wanted to highlight that this is not saying that we want to implement more urban highways. Of course not. We want to eliminate their negative impacts. They do have drastic impacts, specifically when they intersect with these residential communities. However, as we said, in cities like Cairo, with a lot of urban challenges and a lot of underprivileged communities, when we have the situation, it's really important to understand how this ensemble works, how it works in different contexts. And here, speaking about how it works specifically in informal neighborhoods where they have a lot of needs and they have scarcity of space, and they do recognize the potential of these urban highways. So it's important to further investigate, study how this ensemble works and how this could inform decision makers and urban planners in future strategies of upgrading informal settlements, or even in the implementation of urban highways, how these negative impacts could be eliminated and how we can use their potential to produce or to meet the needs of urban residents into the city. And here are the references, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Heba, for your quite interesting presentation. And so far we have one question, which is, are the Cairo City Council or the Egyptian government not considering moving majority of unplanned settlers who reside at these Cairo ring roads to new planned residential areas in Cairo or outside Cairo?
There are actually different strategies into the resettlement or relocation of different informal settlements, depending on the case of each area. But as we always say, this is not always the best or the easy solution, as you cut ties with different work opportunities and different social ties, and people are settled into these areas. So this won't be the case in all the areas inside Cairo, and it's important to study how to actually rehabilitate these urban highways within these informal settlements, and not always move to resettlement or relocation as the main solution for these informal or unplanned areas, as Dr. Heba Khalil was saying.
Yes, thank you for this. So I have also one question of mine, sort of more of, I kind of want you to expand on, I'm really curious about the participatory process with the Omar ibn Khattab, I think, tunnel. I'm sort of curious on, you mentioned that there were some unexpected actors that were involved in a way in this situation. And I was also sort of curious on the role of the government in this situation and how they play a role in these kind of participatory processes.
Let me say that not necessarily unexpected, but it's a more broad range of stakeholders from the parts that take informal interventions. So you have funding agencies or international donors, you have the government, which always comes in partnership into these projects, and they do participate into the different processes in terms of the assessment of the existing situation. Actually, there was a process of the selection of which of the tunnels needs or is a priority for upgrading based on the pedestrian flow, the high flow, which one is more used by the community and which one has more problems that need to be addressed. So governmental entities are always part of these different processes into the assessment, design, and decision making. There are a lot of active NGOs.
Okay, we did lose Dr. Heba Shoaib as well. We had also some internet connections with Ms. Riton. Oh,
I'm sorry,
I think
back.
Dr. Heba just joined. Yeah, okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
I don't know, when did you lose me?
I think you were mentioning at this point the role of the government in these interventions and moving forward with that. Can you hear me, Dr. Heba?
Yes, I can hear you now. I'm sorry, my connection is a bit unstable.
That's completely fine. If your line of thought is sort of cut through, and I understand that.
Yeah, I just I don't know when did stop
basically
hearing
sort
you.
of,
so
if you can expand on the challenges on these participatory process, that would be sort of great into looking into this issue of intersections between formal and informal, because the government comes from the sort of formal regulatory side, and the participants come from more of an informal background in a way. That's
and that's always the challenging process, and a lot of projects that we do at the Queen as well, is these different perspectives of stakeholders, of what the community actually needs and what is feasible, and how the governmental entities do their perspective on.
Okay, I think we're having a lot of internet connection issues today, so we really apologize for the inconvenience. I will be wrapping up the session at this point, since Dr. Rita Nasser's internet connection was not resolved. We will be recording her session, and it will be available on the Padlet webpage and also the YouTube channel of SAS Infra. And this session also will, the full recording of the session also will be available on the events webpage. So please do check it.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just want to inform you that I am back, in case there are any questions for my presentation.
Yeah, so far we didn't have questions. And I do have my own, but given the context and time we're having now, so
no problem.
I'll be in direct contact with you regarding my questions. For the attendees also, if you have any questions that you can raise, maybe this is the final call for this. You can raise any questions for any of the presenters at this point. So if you have any questions for Dr. Christine, please do raise them. If not with this, I'll wrap up the session, and I would also ask you to check the event page for the next SAS Infra Plus webinar session, and the final one. Thank you so much for attending and for your time and for staying with us till the end of the session. And with this, I'm wrapping up the session. Thank you.